They had no idea what they were looking at when I stopped walking. They thought they were watching an ordinary dad. Seconds later, the whole street understood they were wrong. She'd taken this same bus stop home 100 times. She never once needed a stranger to notice. Tonight, she did. Stay right here, sweetheart. You need to leave now. She is with me. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't have to. Some kinds of calm are louder than screaming. For 3 full seconds, nobody on that street said a single word. Then everybody started asking the same question. Who exactly was that man?
The street went completely silent 2 seconds after I stepped between 3 grown men and a woman I had never met in my life, and I know it was 2 seconds because a stranger's phone camera happened to be running the entire time and later showed me the timestamp. Fairview isn't the kind of place where anything dramatic usually happens on a Tuesday. Elm Street runs past a hardware store, a laundromat, and the grocery store where half the neighborhood does its shopping, and most evenings the loudest thing on it is somebody's screen door banging shut. Before that moment, Fairview's Elm Street at 7 in the evening sounded like it always does. A bus idling half a block down, someone's dog barking behind a fence, my 9-year-old daughter narrating an extremely detailed opinion about which brand of cereal we should have bought. After that moment, for those 3 seconds, there was nothing. No cars, no voices, just a bus stop bench, a shaking young woman, 3 young men backing away with their hands half raised, and a street full of strangers trying to understand what they just watched an ordinary shop teacher do in under 10 seconds flat. Almost none of them knew, watching it happen, that the calm in my voice that evening hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from a dusty hillside on the other side of the world, from a friend I couldn't save, and from a version of myself I'd spent 8 years deliberately trying to leave behind. But to understand why that street went silent, and why the woman on that bench turned out to matter to me in a way neither of us could have possibly predicted, you need to go back further than that Tuesday evening, back to a friendship that started in a training barracks and ended on a hillside I still can't talk about without my hands going still. If you've ever wondered whether the hardest things you survive ever end up meaning something later, stay with me until the very end of this story, because I got my answer on an ordinary street corner, and it is not the answer I expected. My name is Sam Reeves, and I spent 6 years as a Marine, the last 4 of them in force reconnaissance, which is a way of saying I spent a lot of that time in places I'm still not entirely comfortable describing in detail, doing work that mostly involved being quiet, patient, and extremely good at not being noticed. I'd grown up in a small town not unlike Fairview, the son of a mechanic and a school teacher, and I joined mostly because I wanted to prove to myself I could do something genuinely hard, not because I came from a family with any particular military tradition. Force recon selection was, without question, the hardest thing I had ever put my body and mind through up to that point, and I remember thinking, somewhere around the 3rd sleepless day of it, that whatever else happened in my life afterward, I would at least always know exactly what my limits actually were. I met Danny Whitman in training, back when we were both 20, and convinced we already understood exactly what we were signing up for. Danny had a way of making the worst weeks of training feel survivable just by finding something to laugh about in the middle of them, and by the time we shipped out together the first time, he'd become the kind of friend you don't really choose so much as recognize, the way you recognize family. He kept a photo of Rachel taped inside his helmet liner, a school picture from when she must have been about 12, gap-toothed and grinning, and he'd talk about her constantly during the long stretches of downtime that make up most of deployment, how smart she was, how she was going to do something with her life that actually mattered, how he intended to be there to watch her do it. We deployed together twice. On the second deployment, on a hillside during an operation I still don't discuss beyond the basic facts, our unit was ambushed, and Danny was hit badly enough that I spent the better part of 2 miles carrying him toward the nearest evacuation point, talking to him the entire way, promising him things I had no actual power to guarantee. I don't talk about the specifics of that day, and I'm not going to start now, except to say that it happened fast, the way these things almost always do. faster than the mind can fully organize into a coherent memory afterward. And that most of what I actually remember is not the danger itself, but the strange, focused calm that training produces in exactly the moment you need it most. The same calm, it turns out, that would show up again 9 years later on an ordinary street corner. He didn't survive the flight to the field hospital. I did survive physically, though it took me a long time afterward to understand that surviving and coming home in one piece are not always the same thing. In the weeks after Danny died, before I'd even fully processed it myself, I sat down and wrote a letter to his family, because it felt like the only concrete thing I could do with a grief that otherwise had nowhere useful to go. I wrote 3 drafts before I mailed the one I sent, tearing up the first 2 because they read, to my own ear, too much like an official report and not enough like the truth of who Danny actually was. The final version took me most of one night to get right, sitting alone in a barracks that felt too quiet without him in it, and I remember reading it over one last time before sealing the envelope and thinking that it was, without question, the most important thing I had ever written. I didn't sign it with my full name and rank, the way the official condolence letters from command usually were signed. I wrote it by hand, described the specific kind of person Danny had been in the ordinary, unglamorous moments nobody puts in official reports. How he always gave his extra rations to whoever was having the worst week. How he could make an entire squad laugh during a sandstorm. How he talked about his little sister constantly, with a kind of pride that had nothing performative in it at all. I signed it only "A brother who was there," because something about putting my actual name on it felt, at the time, like it would make the letter about me instead of about him, and Danny deserved better than that. I mailed it through a chaplain who agreed to forward it without attaching any identifying unit information, and I never once, in the 8 years since, tried to find out whether it ever reached them, or what they thought of it, or whether it helped at all. I told myself that not knowing was part of the point. I left the Marines a little over a year after Danny died, came home, and spent a long time figuring out who I was supposed to be without a uniform or a mission or a friend who could make the worst parts of the day bearable. I met Megan 2 years later at a community college where I was finishing a certification in automotive technology. She was finishing a nursing degree at the same school, and the first real conversation we ever had was in a parking lot at 11 at night. Both of us waiting for the same tow truck after our cars happened to break down within an hour of each other. An origin story we told at parties for years afterward because it embarrassed us both equally. She had a specific gift for making me feel like an ordinary person again, instead of someone people needed to handle carefully. She never once asked me to talk about things I wasn't ready to talk about, and she never once treated my silences like something that needed fixing. We got married 18 months later, and when Hannah was born, I made a promise to myself, quietly, the same way I'd made the promise about Danny's letter, that I would build my daughter an entirely ordinary childhood, one where her father was simply a shop teacher who fixed the family car himself and coached her Saturday soccer games badly but enthusiastically, with no medals on the wall and no war stories at the dinner table. Megan used to say that the bravest thing either of us could do for Hannah wasn't protecting her from every hard thing in the world, but making sure she never had to carry the weight of things that weren't actually hers to carry. And I've tried, not always successfully, to hold on to that specific distinction in the years since. Megan was diagnosed with an aggressive illness when Hannah was 5, and 18 months later I was a 34-year-old widower trying to figure out how to braid a 6-year-old's hair from a video tutorial at midnight, learning all over again what it meant to survive something without quite knowing how to be whole on the other side of it. The hospital stays blurred together now in a way I've mostly made peace with, though I still remember with total clarity the specific afternoon light in the room the day the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do, and the particular terrible calm Megan managed even then, more concerned with how I was going to explain things to Hannah than with anything happening to herself. I leaned harder into the ordinary life I'd already been building, mostly because it was the only thing that felt like solid ground. I taught shop class. I coached soccer. I fixed our own gutters instead of hiring someone. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because doing something with my hands had always been the closest thing I had to peace. Almost nobody in Fairview knew about Force Recon, or the hillside, or the letter I'd written and never followed up on. To the parents at pickup and the other teachers in the break room, I was just Mr. Reeves, the shop teacher whose daughter brought her own canvas tote bag to the grocery store because she'd decided plastic bags were, in her words, bad for the turtles. That particular Tuesday evening started the way most of our evenings did. A grocery run after Hannah's homework was finished, her narrating an ongoing debate about cereal brands the entire 6-block walk home. Me only half paying attention in the specific contented way you pay attention to a 9-year-old's opinions when you've heard 40 variations of them already that month. We'd made the same 6-block walk to the corner grocery store probably 300 times by then. Enough that Hannah had strong, deeply held opinions about which cracks in the sidewalk were safe to step on, and which ones, according to a rule system she'd never fully explained to me, were not. We were a block and a half from our corner grocery store when I noticed 3 young men clustered around the bus stop bench up ahead, their body language wrong in a way I registered before I could have explained exactly why, too close together around a single point, too much sudden laughter that didn't match anyone else's mood, the specific coiled energy of a situation that hadn't turned into something yet, but was clearly deciding whether it wanted to. The woman at the center of it, I could see even from half a block away, had her back pressed against the bench and her bag pulled tight against her chest, her eyes doing the fast, controlled scanning of someone calculating exits rather than panicking outright. I'd noticed, without consciously cataloging it, 3 other pedestrians further down the block quietly speed up or cross to the opposite sidewalk as they passed the bus stop. The specific, practiced avoidance people develop when they sense trouble, but have decided, understandably, that it isn't their trouble to get involved in. One of the 3 men reached for her bag as we got closer, and she jerked it back hard enough that he laughed a short, ugly sound that had nothing playful in it, despite how he was clearly performing playfulness for his friends. Another one had drifted half a step to her left, closing off the direction she'd been quietly angling toward. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in the next few seconds, because it wasn't heroic in the way people later described it. It was simply old training doing exactly what old training is built to do, faster than conscious thought. The specific, quiet click of a part of my brain I hadn't needed to use in 8 years waking back up all at once. I knelt down, told Hannah, as steadily as I could manage, to go wait just inside the doorway of the flower shop we were passing, that I needed her to stay right there and not move until I came back for her. She looked at my face for exactly 1 second, and whatever she saw there was apparently enough because she didn't argue, which she almost always does about literally everything. I walked toward the bus stop at an unhurried pace, close enough to normal that a couple of pedestrians barely registered me passing them, and I want to be clear that what happened next involved no punches, no shouting, nothing that would look, on camera, like the kind of confrontation people picture when they imagine someone handling a threat. The street lamp above us flickered once, and for a strange, suspended moment the only sound I could hear clearly was my own steady breathing and the faint hum of the bus idling half a block away, the whole scene narrowing down to the specific, practiced focus training leaves behind long after everything else about a person changes. I stepped directly between the woman and the man closest to her, close enough that he had to either back up or acknowledge me, and I said in the same even, unremarkable tone I used to tell a shop class to put their safety goggles back on, that it was time for all 3 of them to walk away right now. When the second man moved toward the woman's arm anyway, more out of surprise than actual defiance, I caught his wrist before it got there, held it firmly but without any real force behind it, and repeated, once, that we were done here. I think what actually unsettled them, more than anything physical, was the specific absence of anger in my voice. Anger is something young men squaring up for a confrontation know how to read and respond to. It gives them a script. What I offered them instead was total, unbothered stillness. The kind of calm that only really comes from having stood in circumstances so much worse than a bus stop that this particular moment didn't register as a threat at all, just an inconvenience that needed resolving efficiently. I watched all three of them recalibrate in real time, the bravado draining out of their posture in a matter of seconds, and then, without any further words from me, they backed away, muttered something half-hearted about not wanting trouble, and walked quickly around the corner and out of sight. For a stretch of a few seconds after that, according to the phone footage a bystander later showed me, absolutely nobody on that stretch of Elm Street said a single word. No cars passed. Nobody finished the sentence they'd been in the middle of. It was as if the entire block needed a moment to agree, silently, that whatever had just happened was actually over. I've thought about that specific silence more than almost anything else from that evening, because I don't think it was really about me at all. I think it was simply what a street sounds like in the half-second after collective fear releases its grip, before anyone's quite sure it's safe to make noise again. I turned around to check on the woman, who was lowering herself slowly onto the bus stop bench, hands visibly shaking, and I introduced myself the way you'd introduce yourself to anyone in that situation, first name only, asking if she was hurt, and whether she wanted me to call someone for her. She told me her name was Rachel, that she was fine, just badly shaken, and thanked me in the particular halting way people thank you when they're still working through the adrenaline of realizing how much worse the last 2 minutes could have gone. A patrol officer, a woman named Lena Ortiz who'd been 2 blocks over on an unrelated call, arrived within a few minutes after someone flagged her down, took a brief statement from both of us. She asked, almost as an afterthought while closing her notebook, whether I'd served, and when I gave her a non-committal answer, she just nodded once, the particular nod of someone who'd recognized something in how I'd handled the scene, and decided not to push for more than I was willing to give. I collected Hannah from the flower shop doorway, where she'd apparently spent the entire time explaining sunflowers to a very patient store clerk, and we walked the rest of the way home like nothing unusual had happened at all, though I noticed Hannah held my hand a little tighter than usual the whole way. Hannah, once we were walking home, asked me only one question about what had happened, in the careful testing voice she uses when she's not sure whether a topic is safe to bring up. She asked if the men had been bad guys. I told her they'd made a bad choice, which isn't quite the same thing, and that the woman was safe now, which was really the only part that mattered. She seemed to accept that answer completely, and by the time we reached our porch steps, she'd moved on to a fully unrelated theory about whether our neighbor's cat could be taught to fetch. That night, after Hannah was asleep, I sat at our kitchen table for a long time doing something I hadn't let myself do in years, which was simply sit with the memory of Danny without immediately trying to redirect my thoughts somewhere safer. I thought about the specific way training like mine is supposed to work. You carry it so it's there if you ever need it, and otherwise you're supposed to be able to set it down entirely and live an ordinary life on top of it. For 8 years I'd told myself I'd successfully done exactly that. Standing on that street corner, I'd learned something slightly different. The training doesn't actually go anywhere. It just waits, quietly, for the one moment it's actually needed, and shows up instantly, fully intact, whether or not you've been telling yourself for years that it was gone. A neighbor's phone video of the incident, mostly just the aftermath, the silent street, the 3 young men walking away, Rachel sitting down on the bench, ended up shared in our town's community social media group over the following few days, with enough people recognizing me as the shop teacher from the high school that it generated a small wave of local attention I found almost unbearably uncomfortable. A short piece ran in the community section of the local paper. A local news producer called twice asking if I'd be willing to sit for an interview, and I turned them down both times, partly out of simple discomfort with attention, and partly because some instinct I'd carried since the letter told me that turning a private choice into a public performance would cheapen it in a way I wasn't willing to risk. Parents I barely knew started nodding at me at pickup with a kind of new, slightly startled respect. I answered every question about it as briefly and plainly as I could, deflecting anything that got close to the actual source of my training, mostly because 8 years of practiced silence about that part of my life isn't something that unwinds in a single week just because a stranger's phone caught 3 seconds of stillness on video. Rachel reached out about 10 days later, tracking down my contact information through the local paper's writer, and asked if I'd be willing to get coffee, saying she wanted to thank me properly rather than in the shaky, adrenaline-blurred way she had that first evening. I said yes, mostly out of simple courtesy, with no particular expectation beyond a pleasant, slightly awkward half-hour before we both went back to our separate lives. She'd chosen a small cafe 2 blocks from the nonprofit where she worked, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and she was already seated at a corner table, twisting a paper napkin between her fingers, when I arrived 5 minutes early and found her 5 minutes earlier than that. What actually happened was a 2-hour conversation that ended up rearranging an 8-year-old grief I hadn't realized I was still quietly carrying every single day. We talked at first about ordinary things, her job at a nonprofit downtown, my shop classes, Hannah's increasingly elaborate opinions about sustainable grocery shopping. But at some point, in the easy, unguarded way conversations sometimes drift toward things that matter, Rachel mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd grown up mostly with her mother and an older brother, because her parents divorced young, and that her brother had been the closest thing she'd had to a stable, constant presence throughout her whole childhood. She said his name, Danny, with the specific, careful tenderness people use for someone they lost a long time ago and still haven't entirely finished missing. I felt something go very still in my chest, the way a room goes still right before you understand you're about to hear news that will change how you remember everything that came before it. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, what Danny's last name had been. She told me, watching my face with sudden, sharpened attention, the way you watch someone's face when you sense correctly that a question has more weight behind it than its casual phrasing suggested. When I said the word Whitman back to her, quietly, mostly just confirming it to myself, she went very pale and asked how I knew that. I told her the truth, starting from training and moving forward slowly, watching her absorb each piece as I gave it to her. That I'd served with a Danny Whitman in Force Recon, that we'd been close, that I'd been there on the hillside during his final deployment, that I was the one who'd carried him those 2 miles toward the evacuation point. I watched her hands come up to cover her mouth, the exact same gesture I realized only afterward, that I'd unconsciously made myself in the weeks after it happened. And then, because there was no way to explain the rest of it without saying it plainly, I told her about the letter, handwritten, unsigned beyond 4 words, sent through a chaplain with no unit information attached, written because I hadn't known what else to do with grief that large. Rachel didn't say anything for what felt like a very long time. He used to write us letters constantly before, she said, still working through it out loud. Long ones, funny ones, and then after, there was just the official notification and this one letter that didn't sound like the military at all. My mother used to say it was the only piece of paper in the house that actually sounded like someone who'd loved him. When she finally spoke further, her voice had gone thin and careful, the way voices do when a person is handling something enormous with great caution. She told me that letter had arrived at their house nearly 9 years ago, that her mother had read it so many times the folds had worn soft, that it had become, in a strange and specific way, the single piece of writing that helped their entire family actually grieve Danny instead of simply being devastated by his absence. Because it gave them a Danny who existed in small, human, unglamorous moments instead of only existing as a folded flag and an official report. She told me they'd always wondered who wrote it, that her mother had kept it in a drawer beside Danny's photograph for years, that they'd occasionally speculated about which of his friends it might have been but never had any way of actually finding out. A brother who was there, she said quietly, reciting the exact 4 words I'd signed it with 9 years earlier. And I felt something in my chest finally, after 8 years, come loose. I want to be honest that I hadn't expected, sitting down for a courtesy coffee with a woman I'd helped on a street corner, to end up telling her things I had never said out loud to anyone including Megan. including the few fellow veterans I still occasionally spoke with. I told Rachel about the 2 miles, about the things I'd promised Danny that I had no power to keep, about the specific private guilt I'd carried for 8 years about being the one who survived. She listened in a way that felt less like sympathy and more like recognition, the particular quality of listening that comes from someone who has also spent years carrying a grief they never quite finished sorting through. At some point, she reached across the table and told me, with a directness that undid something in me I hadn't realized was still braced tight, that whatever guilt I'd been carrying about surviving instead of him, her family had never once, in 9 years, blamed me for anything. They had only ever wanted to know that Danny hadn't been alone at the end, and the letter, unsigned as it was, had already told them that much. Neither of us finished our coffee that afternoon either. We sat there for another hour, working through the specific, disorienting shape of the coincidence that the same man who had once tried to save her brother on the other side of the world had completely by chance stepped in to protect her on an ordinary street corner 9 years later, without either of us having any idea who the other person actually was until a shared last name and a handwritten letter connected the 2 moments. Rachel told me, near the end of that conversation, that she'd spent years occasionally wondering, in a quiet, unspoken way, whether the anonymous Marine who wrote that letter had ever made it home in one piece himself, and that some part of her, without fully admitting it, had needed to know the answer to that almost as much as she'd needed to know who he was in the first place. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and I kept in touch, first through the kind of careful, occasional messages 2 people send when they're not entirely sure what they're building yet, and then through visits that stopped needing much of an excuse to happen at all. She met Hannah properly on her 2nd visit, bringing a small bag of sunflower seeds as a gift. Once I mentioned, laughing, the story about the flower shop clerk, and the 2 of them spent an entire Saturday afternoon planting them along our back fence, Hannah supplying an enthusiastic and only occasionally accurate narration of everything she knew about pollinators. By early summer, the sunflowers along our back fence had grown taller than Hannah, and she took to measuring herself against them weekly with the grave seriousness of a scientist, tracking an important experiment, always reporting the results to Rachel first. Next time she visited, as though Rachel had personally been awaiting the data, Rachel started coming around often enough that Hannah began asking, with the specific bluntness only a 9-year-old manages, whether Rachel was going to be around. For good. A question I still didn't have a fully settled answer to, though. I noticed I wasn't in any hurry to correct the hopeful way Hannah asked it. I also, for the first time in 8 years, started letting a little more of my actual history out into daylight. A fellow veteran I'd known loosely for years, a former Army medic named Pete Alvarez, who ran a small peer support group for local veterans, had reached out not long after the community paper's article ran, half joking that he'd always suspected there was more to Quiet Sam from the shop department than any of us let on. Pete's group met Thursday evenings in the basement of a church 2 blocks from the school, a dozen folding chairs arranged in an uneven circle, terrible coffee in a machine nobody had cleaned in years, and I spent my first several sessions saying almost nothing at all, simply relearning what it felt like to sit in a room where nobody needed me to explain or perform anything. I started attending his group sessions, tentatively at first, mostly just listening, and eventually found myself, several months in, telling the story of the hillside and the letter out loud for the first time to a room full of people who understood exactly what that kind of silence costs a person over years of carrying it alone. I don't think I fully understood, until I said it out loud in that room, how much weight I'd been quietly setting down every single day for 8 years without ever admitting the weight was there at all. On what would have been Danny's 40th birthday that spring, Rachel asked if I'd come with her and her mother to the small memorial marker at the veterans section of the town's cemetery 2 counties over, where Danny was buried. I stood beside the 2 of them on a cool, clear morning, Hannah's hand in mine because she'd asked to come too, once she understood, in the careful way we'd explained it to her, that Rachel's brother had been my friend a long time ago. Rachel's mother, an older woman with Danny's exact easy smile, took both my hands in hers at the graveside and told me, simply, that she'd always hoped, somewhere in the last 9 years, that the man who wrote that letter had found some peace of his own eventually. I told her honestly that I thought I finally had, and that it had taken an ordinary Tuesday evening on an ordinary street corner to get me there. I think about that street often, mostly because of how easily none of it could have happened at all. A different bus stop, a grocery run 5 minutes earlier or later, 3 young men choosing a different corner entirely, and Rachel Whitman remains, for the rest of both our lives, a stranger I never meet and a mystery letter she never solves. Instead, my training did exactly what training is built to do, quietly and without asking permission, and the street went silent for 3 full seconds while an entire block of strangers tried to understand what they'd just watched happen. Rachel still keeps the original letter in the same drawer her mother once did, though these days she also keeps a photograph from Danny's birthday morning at the cemetery, the 3 of us and Hannah standing together in the cool spring light, proof, she told me once, that some threads really do find their way back around eventually. I don't think Danny would have called any of it a coincidence. Knowing him and knowing how completely he believed that the people who mattered to you had a way of finding you again eventually, I think he'd have said it was simply overdue. The kind of thread that finds its way back around eventually, whether or not anyone ever understands, in the moment, exactly whose hands are holding the other end of it.